My name's Lewis, and today I'd like the opportunity to talk to you about my latest print, which was inspired by a piece of literature which really touched my heart, Ocean Vuong's latest book, The Emperor of Gladness, in which one line is, "To discard is to move on." A lot of my creative work is inspired by my lived experience, but also the arts in different forms, literature being one in this instance, and drawing on things that really deeply resonate with me. Before I create and during the process of creation, research, looking at the etymology of different concepts is quite important for me. And my subject in most of my work is the body. I don't always depict the body, but I often do, most frequently as portrayals of the male nude. And when I was approaching this new piece of work, I thought quite deeply about what it means to draw the male nude and how that fits in with society. And so I wanted to do some research about that because I was very conscious that the men that I draw are often very athletic, this sort of ancient Greek marble-esque statue type physique, so to speak. And there's something there about upholding certain standards as this is what beauty looks like, that implicitly says, and beauty doesn't look like everything else. And so I turned to the research, and I first found great interest in exploring the work of Abigail Solomon Godeau, who wrote this book, Male Trouble, A Crisis in Representation. And for me it was fascinating to think about the political economy of the male form and how that fits in to society today. For example, the perceptions that the ancient Greeks and the Romans had, for example, on whether a phallus should or should not be on public display on a statue, and if it should, what the size should be. The fact that back then to have a small phallus was seen as more desirable. There is more focus then on the intellect rather than the animalistic nature of sexual activity. And how that has affected representations of the body today, thinking about Western culture where especially in places like France, there was a strong focus on academic depictions of the human anatomy and form, whilst learning to draw and create in art schools, drawing from casts and moulds before being allowed to even progress on to life drawing models. And how lots of those casts and moulds came from these statues from the ancient Greeks and the Romans and since. And so how these images and representations have pertained and why that matters. And I think for me, while this isn't something I've read about, we have to think about this sort of muscular athletic male form's role within society more broadly, and how leaders, somewhat autocratic leaders, one could argue, whether that be Roman emperors or otherwise, even in more recent political history, have often had statues of themselves commissioned and created, and other members of aristocratic society or royalty, etc., people with power. And when these ancient representations and statues were created, the muscularity and athleticism was really defined and a key component of the portrayal. It's probably the thing that people noticed first before looking at the face itself on the statue. And there's something there about the dominance that they have over society. This saying, look, power is not just in my ruling, power is intrinsic to every part of my being. Look at the physical power in my body alone. And then thinking about how this plays into a whole human history, throughout pretty much the length of our history, of gender-based violence and fear, the role of powerful, physically strong men in taking advantage of others, sometimes other men as well, but principally and majoritarily women. And so for all these reasons, I think it's really important that I engage in the academic research and theories around depictions of the male nude. And I don't really have an answer or a resolved reflection on how that affects and will continue to affect what my portrayals look like. But I know it's something that I want to work on and reflect on as my practice continues to evolve. So thinking about the body, I also then turned to the work of Linda Nochlin. This book on the body, and it's quite fascinating. I believe it's relatively short. It's a classic essay, relatively well known within the art sphere, and I may be mistaken, but I believe it started as a keynote speech for a conference, and then it was published as an essay with accompanying photos of different artworks, etc., by Thames and Hudson. And it's interesting to see the history of how often the anatomy was portrayed for certain reasons from, again, a political economy perspective, even looking, again, to return to France, just to use the same cultural context example, the fact that with the French Revolution, often depictions that people would see who were part of everyday society, who didn't have access to these great big rooms of private collections of amazing artwork or galleries, was actually fragmented and dismembered bodies. It was the heads of aristocrats and royalty and kings during the French Revolution saying, look, another one is dead, we are moving forwards, we are progressing. And how these images were a form of storytelling of the present, of the news, but also played a role in the furnace, I suppose, and stoking the furnace and increasing the temperature of the furnace of social change, which eventually, as we know, turned into the abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of a democratic republic in France. And so it's just interesting to consider how art, but more specifically representations of the body, have fit into these different cultural movements and moments. I also wanted to engage a bit with the relationships that we have. There's obviously the relationship with the self and the body, but then there's the relationship with the other. And of course, bodies play a very natural and intrinsic and visceral, untamed role within relationships, physically, sexually. It's a key part of the establishment and continuity of intimacy. And so I did some research using this academic book edited by Anne Brooks, who's a leading sociologist and scholar in such matters, called Love and Intimacy in Contemporary Society, Love in an International Context. And it was really beneficial to read about how love and intimacy have been represented over centuries, from, in more modern times, love in the movies, to think about diversity and intimacy in society, thinking about queer love, something that I had a personal interest in, being a gay man, and how representations and stories around that fit into society today. And so thinking about relationships between sort of the self and the other, I thought also wanted to explore what the research had to say around relationships between the self and the self. In other words, the sense of intimacy we hold within ourselves, our inner psychology, and the role that plays, returning to the line of inquiry here, with portrayals of the body, of the human form, and specifically the male nude. So I explored this this text, which I have read before and I really value, and I returned to specifically for this print which I created, which is about Jung's shadow concept. It is edited by Christopher Perry and Rupert Tower, and the subtitle, The Hidden Light and Darkness Within Ourselves, is fascinating. It talks a lot about the subconscious mind and the role that plays in our consciousness and our relationship that we have with ourselves, as well as more broadly at the social level, the social unconscious, which Jung wrote and theorized about. And so it gave a lot of fuel for thought for thinking about representations of the body, but also the context around the body and around these images when there is a male nude, and how I can incorporate aspects of consciousness and subconsciousness within that. And then taking that thread further, I wanted to think about the self not purely from a Western academic psychological perspective, but also thinking about broader etymologies, the spiritual nature of relationships with the self. And so I read J.L. Garfield's Losing Ourselves, Learning to Live Without a Self, in which he makes a very interesting and quite compelling argument for how much better off we would be individually and as societies if we didn't believe that we had a soul, if this sort of mind, body, soul thing wasn't so separated, but we believed in ourselves as an integrated whole which exists in the now and ceases to exist after death. Now that is a simplification, of course. This is quite a dense book where he explores some fascinating subjects in quite a lot of detail. But for me, it was interesting to consider this, because more recently I've been portraying human subjects in the male form, and even a portrait of myself, in ways which touches on this idea of sort of fragmentation and separation and blurred lines and boundaries. And so thinking about the role that fragmentation has to play within the way an image is depicted, and how that may or may not mirror the implicit assumptions we have around the separation and unification of the body, mind and the soul, was quite interesting. And it's something I want to explore a bit more in future works, which I come to do. And so, having explored a lot around the theory and the academic research, I then turned back to the literature which first inspired me to create a print. And as I said, it was Ocean Vuong's book, The Emperor of Gladness. And this is Ocean Vuong's second book. He's a second generation Vietnamese immigrant to the USA. He is a gay man. He is hugely accomplished as a poet and an author. He is an academic and teaches at some of the leading universities in the States. But with his poetry collection, I think you can very quickly get a sense of how real he is in what he writes about. The reason his work touches me is partially because of his use of words. I find the way that he structures sentences and the vocabulary he employs can be so compelling and emotive for me at a personal level. And at the same time, I find that he manages to hold up a critique in his literature, a critique against the self. There's a level of self-examination which I feel when I read his work, but also a critique against society and social norms, obviously specific to each context, but within some of his poetry that's about, the body and what it feels to be seen in a certain way, being queer, being a gay man, and the roles that relationships have had to play in our lives. The way in which there are agents of society, the police, the military, and more, which can be there to protect us or not, and how dependent that is on the race in which you were born. And so I want to read this very short extract from a longer poem of his called Beautiful Short Loser. And, having heard him speak recently and also read quite a lot of his, if not all of his texts, it's clear that this piece is semi-autobiographical and is inspired by his lived experience. So he writes, "Inside my head, the war is everywhere. I'm on the cliff of myself, and these aren't wings, they're futures. For as long as I can remember, my body was the mare's nightmare. Now I'm a beautiful short loser, dancing in the green. You think I'll need a gun where we're going? Can you believe my uncle worked at the Colt factory for 15 years, only to use a belt at the end? Talk about discipline. Talk about good Lord. Maybe he saw that a small thing moving through a large thing is more like a bird in a cage than a word in the mouth. Nobody's free without breaking open." That piece of text always gives me goosebumps and makes me reflect on that last line, nobody's free without breaking open. But for me, the inspiration for this work itself came from the Emperor of Gladness, and this is a fantastic book, in my opinion, situated in the States in the early 2000s, during the opioid crisis, where this character, through which Ocean Vuong writes, is trying to navigate this all, navigate tensions with expectations from family and fractured relationships, caring and loving those around him, and surviving in and amongst a state semi-enabled epidemic of opioid use. And it's controversial for me to say semi-enabled by the state, but when we look at what we know about the opioid epidemic, especially in the States with misuse and overuse of opioids, we know that different actors had a key role to play in promoting these coming into society. Consulting firms like McKinsey and Company working with pharmaceuticals and government agencies to try and increase access to these medications as much as possible, with no care for the reality that this would increase misuse and overuse and eventually deaths, chasing profits and being seen to be doing things that are helping people in chronic pain over responsibility for the lives of people who fell into opioid addiction. There's something I do care about as a subject, having worked in healthcare before moving into fine art. But anyway, in this book, which I find very moving and I really would recommend to absolutely anyone, it's this line which I mentioned at the beginning of my video: to discard is to move on. And that really resonated with me, and I felt it has a broader resonance. I think there is applicability there to everyone's lives in past, present or future contexts. Whether we are discarding and moving on in the sense of moving on to a new professional chapter, a new career, a new industry, or an academic sense, moving on to a new area of study, or maybe even in a social context, moving on to a different group of friends, a different group of people who support you, or different realizations, to discard one's former beliefs, one's former views of the world, one's former political alliances off the back of something which shook one's mind. Discarding and moving on to something which can be scary, unknown, uncertain. There was always ambiguity in the future. But with that ambiguity comes possibility, opportunity, many great potential futures. And so that line really stuck with me, as you can tell, and I decided to use it in creating my print. And so thinking about how I would visualize this, I decided to first turn to imagery that I had to hand of the male nude and the human body. I looked at this magazine, which I really appreciate the artistry that goes into its creation and the contents within it, called Boys, Boys, Boys. And it has male nudes and depictions of the male body, not always nude, in a way which I feel is quite contemporary and relevant, in a way which recognises the diversity of people. Not always in physical form though. Most people in here are quite athletic and muscular. But for example, we have this image which I enjoy, which is of a man of global majority ethnicity who is taking a self-portrait using an old-fashioned style camera within the contemporary setting of quite a modern bathroom. And so there's a sense of intimacy here, of being allowed into someone's personal space. A bathroom is quite an intimate setting to step into. And the use of an old camera pointing to this sort of continuation of photography that will have happened since its earliest days of people taking images of themselves as well as others. And then I looked at the work of Shen Wai, and I really appreciate his photography as well. You can see on the front cover there is this neck and the collarbones of a man with a thin silver necklace going around. And I find his focus on the body, he sort of crops and focuses on specific areas often, really captivating. But he intersperses the body in his work with botanical and floral subjects, for example, here. And I think there's something quite beautiful about that. There is this sort of mirroring and symmetry of message between the natural world and the human body as being part of the natural world. But also the bodies that he shows aren't always these sort of typically athletic and muscular forms. Sometimes they're more reminiscent, you know, of everyday bodies like mine and most people's, where there's then an implicit message that beauty exists in everyone in different ways, no matter what that might look like. And so, for example, here we've got the top of someone's kneecap with their other knee beneath. You know, this isn't a particularly alluring image, but it's to show the reality of the body in the everyday, in and amongst images that are more athletic and, you know, stereotypically visually appealing. So after looking at that, I thought, well, what photography am I going to draw on? And having looked at quite a lot of research and done a lot of thinking around representations of the male form, but also queer bodies and what that means today, I decided to look at archival history and photography of different photographers, lots of, you know, gay male photographers who took photos of other men through the gay male gaze, obviously, because they're gay men. It will always be through a gay male gaze. And rightly so, they shouldn't try and erase that. And so I started off, I managed to get my hands on this book, The Homoerotic Photograph. Some fascinating images by here, edited by Alan Ellensweig. And I really appreciated the thought-provoking aspects of the imagery, and the texts that accompanied it. We've got images here by George Platt Lynn in the black and white, and he was a very well-known photographer in New York back in the early, and I want to say mid, but it may just be early 1900s. I did quite a lot of research about him after coming across these images. I read a triography in which one of the autobiographies was of his life. And it was fascinating to see his success in his work, often, as a fashion photographer, photographing other subjects as well. But he did quite a lot of photography as well of nude men. But this isn't photography that could be easily and widely published back then. It just wasn't socially acceptable. And so a lot of these images are archival images, which have since been published in books that look retrospectively. And I really appreciate the time that these editors and historical researchers within the fields of fine art and photography have put into sort of holding up, respecting and honouring these images which never got the, I suppose, the attention and respect that they deserved. And so I ended up getting this book, Fully Exposed, The Male Nude in Photography, which is edited by Emmanuel Cooper, because it includes multiple images taken by George Platt Lynn. In the end, though, I ended up coming across another photographer called Bruce Weber, and one of his images I found really interesting and quite provoking, and it's quite an athletic image of a man crouched down, pouring water over his head. But for me, I find it honours the physicality of the human form rather than being sort of overly sensual or erotic. And you can see that image here. The image is titled Man, Palm Beach, and it was taken in approximately 1985. And so I took this image and decided that I would base my print around it. And so when designing the print, having done quite a lot of research, as you know, and looked at imagery, I had to think about how first to represent this man. And so I did quite a lot of sketches and then ended up with this design, which I created on tracing paper of this man, which is relatively fragmented, you can see. It's cohesive, but there's this sense of fragmentation, and that fragmentation was inspired by the quote, "To discard is to move on." What are you moving on to? You're moving on to something new, something different, something that you feel will be more completing, perhaps. And so leaving these gaps speaks to that moving forwards, moving into something of completion. But also returning to the research that I mentioned, looking at Carl Jung's theories around the shadow self and the subconscious, as well as Linda Nocklin's work on the body about quite literal dismembering and fragmentation that existed around the French Revolution and other times. I thought it would be interesting to depict this body in a fragmented form. And this isn't the first time I've done that. I've done some other portrayals of the male nude in a slightly fragmented way. I've made a more sculptural piece out of paper of a portrait, which is sort of just 5 fragments of someone's face. And I've also done a self-portrait which draws on fragmentation. So once I got that design done, I wanted to think about the water, how I'd represent the water in its flow. And so I created multiple different options with different strengths of pencil, and some in white and some in black and some in grey, and then decided what that flow would look like. And the reason I used tracing paper was so that I could think about the composition in a more dynamic way, being able to layer the water on top of the body like so, and think about how does it flow and what does the placement evoke? Is it evoking in a way that's more realistic, or in a way that's more sensual, or in a way that's more fixed or dynamic? And then once I'd done that, I thought about, okay, for me, that image is a strong representation of to discard in quite a literal sense, is pouring water over himself, discarding this water, washing himself. There's a sense of cleansing for something. And that points to the moving on. And how do I want to depict this sense of moving on? And I decided in the end to go for a motif of a very simple archway like this. But I enjoy the fact that it gives an openness to the interpretation. There is an openness around where people have seen these archways and where they think about them as being from before. Some people might think of an archway more in a religious context, going into a cathedral or a church. Others might think of it more in terms of archways of roses or gardens. Others are more residential connections, some are more commercial connection. It really varies based on personal lived experience and cultural context. So I wanted this archway to represent this moving on, this sort of passage into where we don't know what lies behind or through or alongside it. And so using the tissue paper, I thought about what that composition could look like so, you know. It's quite hard to hold up on the camera, but you can see the sense of being able to see what the archway would look like here, and then if it was lower down, and if it was over on this side. And through playing with these three core motifs, I settled on what my design would look like. And I translated that design onto copper, these two copper plates behind me, using carbon copy paper to draw. And then I painted onto it with this clear sort of enamel type resin. And that was used in order to create a plate that will imprint ink onto paper. So I printed these different shapes of the body here, and I painted the archway here, and then I submerge the plates in acid for 2.5 hours. And what happens is the exposed areas, the background, ends up slightly dissolved and corroded, which leaves these painted areas standing out more proud. And it allows me to then wash this all off and then roll it with ink in the colours that I want on the prints and push that against paper. And what comes away as you remove the paper from the plate is the image of the print. But of course I've got two plates here, and the reason for that is so that I can use different colours more easily within the design. So first I would do this plate, roll it with ink, print on this skin colour for the male body, this blue colour for an archway, and then I would do this top plate and I would roll the ink so that it was blue for the water and sort of dark grey black for the vessel from which the water is coming. And I would print that onto the same piece of paper where this image already is, second, to layer it on top. And so that's what I did, and I ended up with the print. And whilst I was pleased with the outcome in terms of the forms themselves, the intensity of the colours wasn't as strong as I would have liked. I was using a new type of ink, which I hadn't worked with before, and you never quite know how it's going to take to the paper until you try it for the first time. And similarly, I was doing this at home rather than in my studio at the Royal College, and so I didn't have access to so much equipment. Usually I would put this under a roller and roll it with this almost like steamroller type mechanism, which puts a lot of pressure on and really prints down the copper onto the paper. Whereas in this instance, I was doing it at home by hand using what's called a Japanese burnish, which is one of these, sort of these bamboo leaf or palm leaf wrapped around a circular disc, and quite literally pushing and rubbing the paper down onto the copper for about 10 minutes to get that transfer of ink across. But it wasn't as strong as I'd like. So instead of starting again, I thought, how can I use this moment to iterate and play and maybe create something beyond what I was expecting that might even be an enhanced version of the artwork which I had in mind. And so I let it dry, and then I decided to use pastels to enhance some of the shapes, to add more colouring to the print itself. I really enjoy working with pastels. A lot of my previous pieces use dry pastel, and I enjoy the earthy tones that you get, but also quite literally the sense that dry pastels are sort of a powder that have been rolled up into this circular shape, And as you work with them, they leave their mark on the paper, but some of the powder dissipates and you blurt away. And if someone, once I'd finished the piece, were to come up and rub their hand aggressively against it, it would smudge the whole artwork. And there's something, although I obviously don't want that to happen, there's something conceptually about the impermanence of pastel as opposed to paint or other mediums, which I really enjoy. It feels a bit like the impermanence of life, which may sound obnoxiously poetic, but when I'm thinking about a principle and a quote, which is my key inspiration from this piece, to discard is to move on, using a medium which has the potential to be marked or have impermanence to it feels quite fitting. Similarly, one of the reasons I enjoy working with copper plates and printmaking is the fact that the process feels somewhat representative of aspects of life. Depicting the human forms on copper and then pushing them into the paper, for me, is a bit like our everyday lives where we interact with people. And when we interact with people, they leave an impression on us, for better or worse. It may be a huge impression that we remember all our lives. It may be a tiny thing that we're never even consciously aware of. But I think it's very interesting to think about this mirroring between everyday life and the processes that I use in my artwork. And that's why I choose some of the processes I do, like pastel and printmaking. And so I worked on this piece and added new colours and tones, and for me it ended up better than I had hoped for. It added a new sense of quality to it, and I decided to then frame it in this sort of wide frame which left untouched, quite expansive areas of paper either side of this square print. And for me that decision was very intentional, because this moving on, moving forward, leaving this empty paper blank around it gives this sense of opportunity, progression, moving on to something new, different possibilities, again, expansive. And so once I'd finished the work, I thought what would be a fitting way to apply it, whether it be where to exhibit it or maybe to gift it. And I decided to gift it to my father for his 60th birthday. With any birthday, I think there's this sense of reflection on the past, looking to the future, and that collides in the present in the sense of celebrating and commemorating this moment of yourself and your becoming and who you will still become with friends and family and loved ones. And so that's even more pertinent on birthdays of decades, 30, 40, 50, 60, and so on. And so I decided to give this to him because whilst it's not a complete literal mirroring of discarding and moving on, there's something with birthdays where there's this sort of washing and cleansing of the body, as in the print, and this moving through an archway into the unknown, but hopefully better, optimistic future, into this expansive space around. And so I hope he appreciates and enjoys having the piece in our family home. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this rather long video. But having not spoken much on Instagram about my practice before, I thought it was nice to take the opportunity to do so. If you've made it to the end, then I'm extremely grateful. And please do feel free to share any questions that you might have about my work, about my practice, about any of the sources or research that I've mentioned. You're always welcome to message me directly or leave a comment. I'll make sure to get back to you.